Good afternoon, everyone. Can I request that people start taking their seats as quickly as possible? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this keynote lecture by Professor Peter Rosenbaum. Now, we only have 45 minutes, so if I started talking about Peter, it's going to take much longer. So I think we'll keep it relatively short. Peter is a professor of child health at McMaster University, and he is the Canada Research Chair and also a co-founder of the CanChild Center for Childhood Disability. More importantly, he is a developmental pediatrician, a mentor, a teacher, and a health services researcher. Now, he's one of the few people I know who can turn a very complex topic into very simple language and simple and easy to understand concepts. So this morning we had the conversation from Wade and Tom, and they said that communication is important. We need to ask families, what do they want? And I think we are going to continue with that communication theme. So Peter, welcome, and we wait to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Arnab, for that kind introduction. The talk today was a lot of fun because it made me think about where I've come from. And what I hope you'll hear in this talk is personal reflection. And when I talk about, for example, health professionals, I'm talking about myself as well as everybody else in the room. And this is a story that allowed me, encouraged me, forced me, quite frankly, to think about how we have been thinking about and talking about issues like predicting the future. So I'm going to give you a brief outline to my talk. I want to look way back. Now, the late 20th century was anywhere from 22 to 40 years ago, and 40 years is a good time because the 1980s were when I started getting involved in research. And if we think about that time, where were we when we were thinking about prognosis? Who was asking about prognosis? What aspects of prognosis do we have in mind, and what was the evidence? And I'm going to address these themes briefly and then move ahead to today in the middle of the 2022 and ask how are we thinking differently. In fact, I'm going to tell you how we're thinking differently, suggest that we're asking different questions and offering different answers. And I'd like to explain why this has happened. I know from sitting in the middle of the audience that you can't see the bottom of the screen. So the bottom of the screen says, you can decide if this makes sense. So in the 20th century, looking back when most of us were starting our careers, and certainly when most of us were being trained, cerebral palsy was primarily a motor disorder. And gross motor functioning, and particularly mobility, was the classic impairment. And if we think about the international disability symbol, in many parts of the world, this is the symbol. Now, this is not the symbol for cerebral palsy, but it is a symbol of disability. And I think it is strongly associated with the ways in which we have thought about conditions like CP. Walking, for many people, was seen as a marker of success. It was a success for the child, and it was probably a success for us because we'd done good orthopedic surgery, we'd done good therapies, and we'd done good provision of the approaches that would encourage functioning with mobility and particularly walking as success. And the late 20th century, therefore, with evidence, we had the GMFCS, which some of you have heard of, motor growth curves, which I'm going to show. We had evidence to support prognosis. And some of you may know, I don't know if that fits on the whole, oh, it doesn't fit on the slide, but it fits there, okay. Prospective studies, which we carried out in Ontario in the late 1990s, or in the late 1980s and early 90s, allowed us to look at patterns of motor development, gross motor development, by GMFCS level. And this paper published in 2002 provided us, probably for the first time ever, evidence-based ways to predict mobility, gross motor mobility. Pero, my Spanish word for the talk. What were our assumptions? The first assumption was, and again, I'm saying this, I'm trying to be analytically critical, but not rude. And again, I'm including myself in this because this is how I was thinking. This is how I was trained to think. We saw disability as a problem within the person. Impairments were, and still to a large extent are, often treated quite actively in an effort to promote functioning, and particularly our goal traditionally was to reach normal. Remember that idea. Success was, and perhaps still is, measured by changes on the GMFM, a decent measure, which was specifically purpose-designed and validated to be able to measure change in motor function. And success was, and sadly still is, misassessed, not by anybody in this room, I hope, by changes on the gross motor function classification system. And there's a very good paper in Developmental Medicine a few years ago by Megan Towns, which shows the dozens and dozens and dozens of ways that people used the GMFCS wrong. And you notice that the MF in GMFM and GMFCS was motor function. That was what we were interested in. Other assumptions, we were assessing, we didn't think about it this way, but we were assessing functional capacity, that is, best ability, under specific standardized circumstances. When we used the GMFM, we did it in a laboratory setting, in a clinical setting, but I'm calling it laboratory in quotations, because that was the standardized place where we assess children. And there are, as you know, those of you who've used the GMFM, there are rules for how to use it. And we then expected that based upon capacity, what we saw in the clinic, that that's what people would do in the outside world, what people nowadays call performance. And we didn't particularly pay attention to, or even necessarily have an awareness of, other things like environmental factors, like personal factors. And you heard some good illustrations of this in Iona's talk this morning about the boy wanting to learn how to herd sheep, or whatever the phrase is, muster sheep, I guess, for which my wife says we need a muster class, and things that kids wanted to do in the real world, and we were disappointed when they couldn't do them because they had good GMFM scores in the clinic. And we were not even thinking about the effort that was required to do motor function. How many people here are staying in this hotel on the 4th or 5th floor and taking the elevator? And if you are able to walk the stairs, why are you taking the elevator? Because it's hard work. And so we didn't think about those things. Were we bad people? Don't think so. I just don't think we had much imagination about these issues because they weren't part of how we were trained to think. We didn't have the ICF advertising. Did we do any harm? I hope not. We and parents, and probably lots of kids, were on the same page that the goal was walking. That was an important goal, and anything else was not good enough. Wheelchairs were, as I said already, often the last resort. And if we think about the language we use, certainly in English, we often talk about people being confined to a wheelchair. which is an appalling way to talk about somebody for whom a wheelchair is liberating. And people who use wheelchairs are only confined when their wheelchair is broken. But I cite this to point out that in the community at large, outside of rooms like this is how we used to think, and still sadly do think, about issues like using a wheelchair. The question is often asked, well, does this mean therapy's wrong? Absolutely not. Does this mean professionals are bad people? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we directed our knowledge, such as it was, and our efforts into particular directions. And I'll come back to these questions in a couple of minutes. So what's new? Well, the 21st century ideas about functioning and disability are powerfully influenced by the ICF framework for health, and I think have been transformative in opening up the scope of how we think. We're not ignoring impairments, we're not ignoring therapies, we're not ignoring intervention, but we're thinking much more broadly about those things. And we're now paying attention, and again, Iona talked about this beautifully when this boy with level 3 or 4 cerebral palsy wants to learn how to muster sheep. That's a personal factor for him, and we're paying attention to the voices of children and the voices of families in a way we didn't traditionally do. We're also paying attention to environmental factors and recognizing that some of the things people want to do need a different kind of ability and support than they might need in the clinic. We're interested in functioning in everyday life, and the World Health Organization's ICF framework is the International Classification of Functioning, ING, an active word, and not just in function in standardized settings. And disability, this is a really important idea for me. Disability in the World Health Organization is a social idea. I am ready to go, but the environment, the physical environment or the attitudinal environment or the political environment doesn't allow me to do what I can do when things are supportive. So disability then becomes a social idea. And this again is a fundamentally different way of thinking than we used to have. And I hope everybody recognizes this set of boxes, this interconnected set of ideas where there are problems in body structure and function which may interfere with activity, which may interfere with engaging in life, called participation, and you've heard about that very well here, in the context of personal factors, what matters to you, and in the context of environmental factors, which are human and physical and political and attitudinal and economic and so on. So if we'll take a brief break. This is not Mark Peterson, but if you don't understand why this slide's funny, ask the person beside you. One of my favorite slides. So thinking about communicating prognostic information, this is another of my favorite slides, and many of you who've heard me talk will know that I always find some reason to put this slide into the talk. This is to illustrate what's the question. And when I show this slide, I say that the child who answered the question, here it is, has found X. And the teacher who asked the question should fail because it was a bad question. The question should be, what is the value of X, or how long is the hypotenuse? So this is an example of asking the question thoughtfully. So if we think about prognostication now, who wants to know and what do they want to know? What questions are parents asking? When are they asking? And I'll come back to that in a minute. And what are we answering? Really important. And it builds on the connection between what we're being asked to do and whether we're listening and whether we're providing answers that connect with the things we've been asked. Some really interesting work being done by one of my colleagues, Paula Chagas, who is a Brazilian academic physical therapist who's actually spending a year as a postdoc with us. And she's down the street from me in her COVID, hermetically sealed room, and I'm in my house. So we don't actually see one another face to face very much. And she has created a simplified briefer family report version of the GMFM. And this now focuses on performance in usual environments. The parents report what the children do, however they do it. If they use braces, if they need to hold on to furniture, if they use a walker. So we're now reporting gross motor day-to-day performance. And there are pictures that illustrate all of these items. We have some nice evidence of validity of the measure, and some further work is underway right now in both Brazil and Canada. And two of the reasons that this was done is that Paula wants to replicate the motor development curves that I showed at the beginning, but she wants to do that in a low and middle income country, Brazil, and she wants to do that across the country, and it is not possible, even without COVID, to do hundreds and hundreds of GMFMs. We did 2,600 to do the curves we did. It's not possible to do that. So she was looking for a way to get parent report, and then, of course, COVID got in the way as well. So the ideas that we're now pursuing are ICF influenced ideas. So again, thinking about what's the question. I showed this slide, it's the same slide, but I want to remind us that we have to think about what question we're trying to answer. So the question becomes, how should we offer prognosis? Well, the first message, and I know that people in this room know this, but it's really important. We need to wait until we're asked. I've had conversations with parents for years and years and years about things reflecting on a first visit and the things they didn't ask me. And I'll ask them a month or a year later, didn't you want to know about prognosis? Didn't you want to know about such and such? And they said, of course we did. We weren't ready to ask because we weren't ready to hear the answers. So the key idea in giving prognosis is to wait until we are asked, not to tell people how smart we are. They already know that we're smart enough. They've come to see us and get our advice. But we need to not load them with information they're not ready for. We always need to try to understand the question. What is the question they're asking? So if they ask us, will my child walk, we can ask them to clarify what they mean before jumping in and answering it. The motor growth curves were a pretty decent piece of work, I think, but they were 20th century work. The GMFM was assessed, and of those of you who are doing it properly know this, you assess the children barefoot, no aids and no equipment. So we're essentially assessing the in-the-body capability under standard circumstances. So how should we think about this now? If parents want to know about walking and we ask them and they say, well, we want him to be able to get around on his own, or her, because there are girls as well, then we can discuss a whole variety of aided and supported mobility activities. And Roz Livingston is doing a workshop on this tomorrow. And again, in 2022, I think people in this room know this. And again, Iona showed this in the ways in which that young boy was being supported to have independent mobility. The answers we provide will be quite different than, is my child going to walk, based upon GMFM curves from 20 years ago. And I think we can be more optimistic about potential performance in day-to-day life of mobility in ways that are acceptable to young people, that can be efficient and hopefully can be available. And they do not need to be highly expensive pieces of equipment. For those of you who have time, read Christy Brown's My Left Foot, a book published when he was 22 in 1954. And those of you who haven't read the book but have seen the movie, remember that his brothers found an old wagon and pulled him all over the place in the wagon. That was really low tech, but it enhanced his mobility, enhanced his ability to engage in life. And I like to use the example of training wheels. I've had many, many conversations with parents and with therapists, and I'll see a 2-year-old with mobility limitations and I'll suggest the child should have a walker. And they say, oh, no, we wanted to walk. And I said, well, you have an older child, yes. Does your older child ride a two-wheel bicycle? Yes. When they were learning, did they use training wheels? Yes. Did they still need the training wheels? No. And then I say, with a wink, how come your 8-year-old who rides a two-wheel bicycle could have a walker, but your 2-year-old can't have training wheels? To try to make the point that we are inconsistent in our expectations of typically developing kids who get as much support as they need, but we want kids with impairments like cerebral palsy to do things beautifully without any support. So here's a picture we could spend an hour talking about. Those of you who are critical will recognize that this boy's seating posture at the time the picture was taken could be better. Those of you who are optimists will see that he's got a lot of equipment. He's also got a huge smile on his face. Why? Because as you see at the bottom of the slide, it says, first day of junior kindergarten. Now, this boy could have 1,000 years of the best therapy we will ever have. And at the end of 1,000 years, based on what we know on May 20th, 2022, he will still have cerebral palsy. But with his technical aids, he is going to school, and he will be independently mobile in his device. So we should focus on what can be rather than what cannot be. He's never going to walk, but that's not the question we're answering in 2022. We need to think about child development, child and family strengths, functioning, achievement, being family-centered, and so on, and having conversations with parents that help them to recognize that being empowered, and I use that word in English as a pun, both empowered in the sense of enabled, and in his case, having a power chair, will open his world up to him in ways that will never be possible if we limit him to having to do things nicely and normally. And we want to de-emphasize fixing because we don't know how to fix. We need to de-emphasize normality because it's a silly idea at the best of times. And we need to recognize that this boy is not disabled unless he gets to school and there are stairs and he can't get into the school. And then he will be disabled. Right now, he has an impairment and the power to do things. Do we do any harm? Have we done any harm? I hope not. But I think we can have a broader conversation with families. We can consider, as Iona talked about, children's wishes and goals, and parents as well. And we can help parents to see that using technical aids, if necessary, will empower children to have mobility and capacity to explore their world and to have more independence than if we just expect them to do things the right way. We need to think about aided mobility enhancing functioning and not as a yes-no activity. We need to recognize that young children may need technical aids that they no longer need later on, and that they may go back to using when they become teenagers and their body shape changes, or they go to high school and the classes and the halls are busy and slippery in our case in the winter, and so on. So is therapy wrong? Of course not. But what are the questions that we're trying to answer in 2022 that may be different than the questions we were answering 20 or 30 years ago? And are we misguided? I don't think so. But I think we have a different set of ideas and a different framework against which to think about these questions. Can we do harm? Yes, I think we can if we impose our values on families. We need to meet families where they are, recognizing that the next time we meet the family, some of the ideas we talked about today may have been incubating in their minds as well. So this is not a one-time answer. This is a process. If we fail to seek and listen to children's goals and wishes and those of their parents, then we can be doing harm, because we are being arrogant and failing to take account of where they are at and what's important to them. And I think we can be doing harm if we see aided mobility as failure, as a sign of giving up. Whereas when children have mobility enhancements as needed, their parents see them very differently. the community sees them very differently. They see them as active participants rather than passive recipients of somebody else's mobility help. So in thinking about prognosis, we need to understand who is asking the question and what they're asking. And we're much more interested in children's voices than we used to be. We need to think about the ICF in terms of biomedical concepts, but also about participation and engagement and personal factors and environments and so on. And these are not at odds with, these are not fighting with each other. This is a broader way of looking at the kids we see. I think the ICF ideas encourage us to widen the scope of our thinking, to make the spotlight bigger, to include but go beyond the classic functioning of the body. And parents appreciate and value these concepts, and we have a ton of evidence to support that. These ideas can be liberating for everybody, including children and youth who want to avoid a life defined by medical services. Yeah, so I'm going to stop and leave it open this up for questions and challenges. I love people to say yes, but what about? Because that's how I'll keep learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. That, as usual, was illuminating. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. Peter welcomes challenges. So I can't see any hands up as yet. There is one.
Yeah, please use the microphone so
Yes,
everybody, including me, can hear you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosenbaum.
Only Dutch people cannot ask questions.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Something that I struggle with personally as a clinician, do you feel like we should be more advocates for an accessible society, not just at an individual patient's level, but should we get out more and stand up for those ideas instead of keeping them in our clinical rooms?
Absolutely. And I've been interested in the few days I've been here in how many people I've seen using mobility devices and how it seems to me that this community is pretty accessible in terms of curb cuts and so on. Can we do better? Of course, we can always do better. And part of the argument, I think, needs to be that things that are good for a few people who use wheelchairs are also good for the rest of us who are pulling our suitcases or pushing our baby in a pram or doing other things where our hands are busy and the doors open automatically. And this is an argument that I think needs to be made very strongly, that universal design, which is of course what Yale is talking about, is for everybody. By definition, it is universal. It is not for the small, noisy minority of people like us who are saying you need to have things accessible. It's for everybody. So there is work to be done, and I think we can help policymakers and other people understand that in a way that does not come across as a fight, but as a recognition that this is good for everybody. So thank you for the comment.
More questions? There's a hand up at the back. While the microphone is getting there, Peter, just on the back of that, do you see the role of organizations like the EACD and other academies taking this on as an advocacy role about how we are framing the discussions?
Absolutely, but rather than politicizing it with fights, I think we can help each other with ways of framing these arguments and these stories, so that policymakers understand them. We have the privilege at CanChild of working very closely with governments in 2 provinces of our country. And we work with people who are very smart and very dedicated and very hardworking, but none of them comes to meetings like this. And so they don't spend time thinking about things in this way. But we can have conversations with them which inform them, not because they're not smart, but because they haven't thought about things this way. And this is one of the ways that I think all of our organizations can be helpful. And this is a change for me. I used to think that those were nasty people who just didn't care about the things we care about. That's not true. That's not true. They care deeply. They want to do good things. They want to be smart policymakers, and we can help them by the ways in which we explain things and frame things, and the ICF framework is one of the ways to do that. And the F words, and we have good evidence of this, have caught the attention of policymakers as well. So this then brings these ideas to them in ways that are acceptable. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a question. It's a very inspiring talk. Thank you very much. You advise us for waiting for questions from the parents and learning to understand the questions and taking them into account. What to do when there is no questions? We are sometimes faced to families that are poorly concerned by the situation, complicated families, dysfunctional families. Yep. What strategies to adopt in those cases?
So what do we do when the family who should be asking questions isn't asking questions? Well, if it is at all possible, I believe we should never see a family once. I think if we are the first professionals who are seeing the family who have concerns about their child's impairment, we should have whatever conversations we have informed by their questions, their story, the child's assessment, and so on, and share with them how we are thinking about things, and always, in my opinion, arrange to see them again in 2 or 3 weeks. The next time we see them, they may ask the same questions, or the questions may be the same words, but they're different questions because they've thought about things, they've talked to their family, they've gone to Dr. Google, who is in her office 24 hours a day, and whether she's right or wrong, they have more information. And when they come back, we can have a similar conversation to the first one, but almost always the questions they ask and the things they're interested in have evolved from the first time.
Thank you, Peter. We've got a couple of questions online here. So the first one is from Francesca. I'm a parent of a young boy with CP and an advocate for this community of people. My question, where does parents' autodetermination end and child autodetermination start? Are we sure that a doctor is the right person to assess this threshold?
And anybody here who's a parent will know that this is a question not about disability, but about child and family development. That clearly has to be discussed and negotiated between parents and children all the way along. A 3-year-old wants to do something, or particularly a 2-year-old wants to do something, and the parent has to intervene often because the child is like a teenager in training and thinks they know everything. But when that same child is 4 or 5, the discussion we have with them is different because their understanding of the world is different and our awareness of their abilities is different. I don't think we should allow children ever to dominate the parenting role. Parents have a responsibility, but knowing what the child's wishes are and building on that, one of the F words in our framework is fun. What's fun for children? How can we enhance that? And if we can enhance what's fun for them, like mustering sheep, they will want to do it. And if we want them to have therapy and they hate therapy, they're not going to want to do it. So how can we put together what the child's values are, what the parents' wishes are for their children to be as capable as possible in a way that integrates these things.
We have one more question there.
Is there one online, though? Because they should have a chance, too. Do you want to do this one first?
Yes.
Up to you. Hi, Nathan Rosenberg, Nationwide Children's Hospital. Hi, Peter. Good to see you again. So Rosenbaum, what happens is I get handed your packet at most, including this one. So I'm hoping you'll change my practice a bit. There's two angles on the prognosis conversation. There's wait until you're asked, and then my personal practice, which I might change now, is to say, are you interested in speaking about the future? And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the contrast between those two things.
I might ask it a little bit differently. I might ask, how are you thinking about the future? And in some cultures, future means tomorrow, as opposed to what are you going to do after your second postdoc? So I would ask, how are you thinking about tomorrow? And when they say, what do you mean? Well, where do you hope your child will be able to be at with respect to their activities and their friendships and so on? But often, we don't have to ask that question, because if we've been listening carefully, parents have been talking about those things. She doesn't have any friends. The parent says that, and that may be a passing comment, but it speaks to something that is of concern to the parent and allows us then to pick up on that and find out what the parent means by friends. What does the child mean by friends? We obviously should talk to the children and ask them about what's important to them. I always start by asking, what do you want to boast about? Because that will give us a lot of information about what the parents are seeing in their child that they're valuing, and the parent what's he good at. And if they tell you that he's good at getting into mischief or being a pain in the neck, that's a pretty important message about the fact that the parent can't see what the child is, but only what the child is not. So I think there's a lot of information that's there already. Parent is worried about whether they'll be able to go to school. That's an issue in the future, which tells us that that's an opportunity to start understanding why they're concerned about that, what they see as possible barriers, and so on. So I think there's a lot of clinical skill that we have that we can take advantage of.
He wants to come back. Go on then. Oh, saying thank you. One of the reasons I find in my practice when parents don't want to know is when there are consequences for them because of community or ostracization. And there are certainly many areas of the world where that still remains a huge problem. How do we tackle that?
How long have you got? There are no easy answers to that. I think you raise a really important observation about the fact that I suspect that none of us lives in a homogeneous community. We live in communities that are made up of people from all over the world, people with a range of cultures and values and so on. And we need to understand what those values are and understand what the concerns are so that we can potentially start to address them. We might, for example, and I'm just pulling this right off the top of my head, if a child's in a school, and let's say it's an ethnically specific school in a culture that doesn't accept disability, would the parents be interested in having us come to the school and meet with the staff, meet with the children? There are various kinds of things we can do on an informational and advocacy basis that might, in that kind of a situation, at least allow people to have an open conversation, allow people to ask questions, and so on. Is this kid in the wheelchair? Does he have a contagious condition? Can I catch it? Can my kid catch it? Is this child going to have bad behavior because they're in a wheelchair? And again, those kinds of prejudices or those kinds of of questions based on ignorance are things we can address if we know what they are. So I think there are things we can do, and it comes back to the very first question that Yael asked about our opportunities, and I would say our responsibility to be advocates not only for this child, but for our field.
Thank you. A question online about waiting for families to make questions. What is the attitude you recommend for the therapist when families ask for impossible things?
When they ask for impossible things, I mean, who said it was impossible would be my first question. If the parents of that little boy I showed you who's going to junior kindergarten, if they said, we don't want a power chair, we want him to walk, the conversation that I would have, that's not a boy I know, by the way, that's just a picture we found somewhere. I would have a conversation with them that would include questions like, when he can walk, what do you want him to do? Now, I know that walking is symbolic of the fact that he's now cured or fixed, but what will he do when he can walk? Well, he'll be able to go to the park and play. He'll have friends. Well, one of the ways we can think about doing that while working on walking is give him a mobility aid, which will allow him to go to the park and meet other children and so on. I probably would not say, are you crazy? He's never going to walk. I would say, let's try to help him do the things from a developmental point of view that he would be doing if he didn't have cerebral palsy, so that he can get on with the development part of his life. And by the way, and Charlene Butler showed this in the mid-1980s, with the empowerment that AIDS will provide, he may be much more interested in trying to do the things that were difficult before. It's a little bit like constraint-induced therapy. It's really difficult at the beginning, and Iona showed this as well. And then the child starts to do it, and they practice it, and pretty soon they're doing it. So we need to help parents not put out the fire of their excitement, but give them the idea that supporting development will be a useful thing to do. I bet that every single person in this room at some point when we were learning to walk held on to the furniture. And our parents hopefully didn't stop us from doing that because it was a step in our development. And now we only need to hold on to the furniture after a really good party. So we need to, if we think developmentally, we can have a different conversation than if we think just medically, because that little boy will never, ever be fixed, but he can have a heck of a good life using his power wheelchair and his smile and his schooling and his friends. So those are the kinds of conversations that I think we can have with families.
One last question there, and then we will need to wrap it up.
Hi, this is Anjan from India. I'll start with a catchphrase that we use, which goes to the heart of your talk. We say, disability is only in the eyes of the beholder. My question to you is...
I'm sorry, say it again, Arjun.
Disability is only in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah.
So that's our catchphrase, and we have great results by incorporating all these ability issues. My question to you is what Bernard asked Iona, because it is your paper of 2016, I believe. Is cerebral palsy a diagnosis anymore?
Is cerebral palsy? I deliberately edited out the last part. Is there cerebral palsy?
Is cerebral palsy a diagnosis anymore?
Yes.
Fine, I believe you. You had your paper which said that we have to rethink that. That was your paper in 2016.
Okay, the short answer that's slightly longer than yes is that it depends what we're talking about. From the point of view of thinking developmentally about impairments in functioning and trying to promote functioning, I think cerebral palsy as a term has utility. Is cerebral palsy a disease? No. Are there disease processes that produce impairments in motor development? Yes. The question has always been so polarized as a yes-no question, and it's really not a good question in that way, and you know that, which is why you asked it.
Thank you, Peter. We certainly will need to wrap it up. And I want to do that with a comment which is there online from Deirdre Fitzgerald from Ireland. And she says, always inspiring to hear Professor Rosenbaum speak, striving for a truly inclusive life where a child is not defined by their disability, but by their strengths and value they bring to the world, continues to form the foundation of the vision we have for our sons' life and future. Thank you for everything that you do. I couldn't have some good.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.